Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today is the 19th episode of this endeavor that we have together, and today is Friday, July 31st of 2020. I'm going to be joined today by Valerie Obenchain from Advanced Interactive Response Systems. She's a respiratory therapist as well as a startup founder. After that, I'm going to be joined by some of our team, Aaron Kehrer and Adrienne Harris from Into Being, and we're going to be talking about certain startup fallacies that folks run into over and over again, and we want to talk through those with everybody. After that, we'll do some Q&A like we always have time to do. I want to first welcome Valerie Obenchain, founder of Advanced Interactive Response Systems and a certified respiratory therapist. Valerie, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me, Gene. And just to correct you, I'm a registered respiratory therapist.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's a difference.
There's a difference.
It's all right.
Let's actually start there, Valerie. Tell us a little bit more, because I think folks may not know what a respiratory therapist does. They might have a vague sense, but can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, for a long time, nobody really heard of respiratory therapist. We're kind of like the redheaded stepchildren of the hospital, kind of. So they only call you when they need you. But basically, we do cardiopulmonary. So we specialize in the heart and lungs, also do a lot with the airway. We have a wide range of responsibilities. They go from anywhere from doing sleep studies and pulmonary function testing, echocardiograms, your basic EKGs, ABGs. Oh, some people go to study just neonates and they help out with those premature babies. There's also, some people do sleep studies and the oxygen studies. We're the ones that are there to help ventilate the patient, put them on the ventilator, and there to get them off the ventilator, which is one of the most important things too, being able to wean those patients off the ventilator. We do things like breathing treatments, and we also put people on non-invasive, kind of like a BiPAP or a CPAP to help out with ventilator support. We try to use the ventilator as kind of the last resort. So we try to keep them off the ventilator is our goal. And when we put a patients on the ventilator, we do right from the beginning are looking at how we're gonna get them off. So
that's obviously something that we all became way more familiar with than anybody wanted to recently. Of course, the original push with COVID was we need ventilators, and then something that I think folks like you knew as well. That's not the greatest thing in the world. This is not the best place to be. Let's see what we can do that prevents us from getting there. And now the treatments are coming along and people are learning how to manage things a little better. What in general practice, and we'll talk about COVID here in just a second, but in general practice, so you're doing sleep studies, you're doing ventilators and BiPAPs. What kinds of conditions do patients present with that you are working on?
I see with what's been going on with COVID patients is a decrease in oxygen levels. They're beginning like kind of a fluid buildup in their lungs and having trouble breathing. And that's when you know it's getting serious, when it's starting to pack oxygen. So we do a lot of monitoring with like SpO2 to make sure the patients are receiving the correct amount of oxygen. So we've noticed a lot of issues with oxygenation, but I've noticed that the treatments are varying from locations. Some hospitals and facilities aren't doing like our typical albuterol nebulized treatments and the high flow oxygen. The high flow is something I thought would be kind of popular, but I think they're looking at it as more of an infection control issue because it's not a closed system. So you have all these particles that are being released in the air. So I think it might be a good treatment for them. I think they're worried about keeping that isolated. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. This is definitely something different than what we've ever experienced before.
That's interesting, because what you say there rings a bell with all the emergency use authorizations that FDA was going through. One of their big questions, they waived a lot, but one of their big questions for breathing support systems was, what are you doing to control aerosolization? That was just a huge thing for them. So that rings true, what you're saying there.
Yeah, they really don't want to see a closed system because they don't want somebody who's got COVID and when they exhale and all those bacteria and is going all over and making it risky for the patients or for the people that are working with them too and on them. So if you ask me what should be going on right now in the hospital systems, we should be gowned up head to toe. Our shifts should be 4 to 6 hours, gowned up, totally gowned up to see these people. We should be correctly protected and if I was totally gowned up, I would still feel okay with going into a room with somebody who was getting like a high flow treatment. But you have to be, correctly protected. But if it's done right, I would still look at that. I would rather try that on somebody than have to put them on the ventilator. So.
Interesting. There's more we could be doing for them, but part of that is the aerosolization question. So maybe better to protect the healthcare workers and try that treatment and see where it goes. Interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
A lot with Vapotherm is one of the big ones that do high flow. Typically, a lot of places don't have many of those too, so I'm sure there's limitations on how many people could be using it at the time too. But using like the CPAPs and the BiPAPs too. I think checking the oxygen and finding out if there's issues early on definitely helps out, because then you can start those treatments early. It could start out with just a couple liters of oxygen, and then if it does continue to progress, we could do like CPAP and BiPAP, which is a non-invasive way to help with the ventilation. So before going into like the high flow or a ventilator.
That staged approach, do everything you can early and before you get to a point where you need those kinds of tools, which we're thankful they're there, but it's not where you want to end up.
Right.
When we were chatting earlier, Valerie, you had mentioned the differences that the respiratory community is noticing between COVID and other things. And you went all the way back to sort of to your training and said there are things about this that are different. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, the amount of time that this COVID is living on surfaces, I think it's still undetermined. There's a lot of different data, and it's kind of all over the board, but we've never seen it, be so resilient. One of the things, heat used to always kill a lot of these germs. So to see this, I mean, it's Florida, it's summertime, and seeing the numbers go up, that is just odd. We don't usually see that. We would expect, most of us all expected like a second wave to be around flu season, maybe, around November time, that we would see like another influx, because that just kind of makes sense. And that's what typically, these flu viruses do. But now it's just kind of, I think it's caught everybody a little off guard, and this is definitely something new, and we're still learning about, because if you can look at all the different data, one says one thing and the other says the exact opposite. So it's hard to know the exact numbers of what's really going on. So.
Yeah, there's so many nuances with the data and so many variables in play that to look at one graph tells you exactly nothing at that point. Yeah, no, that's interesting. But the point that you made when you mentioned heat, you weren't saying like sterilization heat. You're just saying, if I understand correctly, that when we're in a hot place like Florida or other places, whether the wave had come or the wave had gone, we wouldn't normally expect to see that happen in a hot environment. It would wait until there was a colder season. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, because usually the flu seasons are in our cold seasons. We usually, from November to about March is where we see, the big incline in flu. And, people die from the flu every year. I mean, that's true. But this is just different. This is definitely different. And everybody's impacted a little bit differently from it. It's kind of weird. We're still trying to figure out exactly what makes one person have little to no symptoms and the next person is, dying or has these symptoms that go on for months. And even after these people are somewhat recovered, we're seeing problems with their oxygen, that they're weak, that they're still having issues that are long lasting, loss of, smells and taste, and a lot of just, odd things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You had mentioned also the types of responses that people are having. You had brought up the T cell, not issue, but it sounds like we're still unsure as to how the body fights this kind of infection. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's like you had the presenter on last week, and he was talking a little bit too about the different types of reactions, like when people are exposed to like the cold and the flu virus early on, is that showing that they're, less, or more resilient to COVID. They're looking at that. I've seen people looking at the different types of people's blood and, what that role may play in it. I can't remember what blood type they said was not the right one to have, because I don't think we've got enough real data and information to say anything concrete on a lot of these issues yet. So we're going just by what I'm going by is basically what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from my colleagues. So
yeah, that's kind of what you can go off of at the moment. Have you and your colleagues noticed anything in terms of the whole pre-existing condition question?
definitely issues with patients, anybody who's had any type of respiratory issues. We're noticing a lot with COPD patients. And COPD is it's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So it encompasses a few different types of respiratory issues like chronic bronchitis and emphysema are some of the big ones. So I don't think a lot of people realize, but there are 175 million people in the world. That's a big number. 175 million people in the world with COPD. These are the patients that are at risk. These is what I would classify as the high risk patients. And now there's different stages of COPD. Some of them start off where they're not, too bad and they're manageable, to all the way where they're pretty severe and, on oxygen, 100% of the time. So there's a lot of variations. There's things that we could do to kind of help manage, but there is no cure. So this is the fourth leading cause of death in the United States. That's here in the United States. There's over 12 million people in the US that have COPD. So there's a large population. There's some things that I've noticed with their COPD patients. They have a trouble wearing the mask. And there's all these studies. Does it affect your oxygen? Not really, it doesn't. I've checked the oxygen, but I've seen how short of breath these COPDers are. What I believe to be true is because a lot of our COPD patients also are CO2 retainers. These are the patients that I think are having trouble wearing the mask because their CO2 levels are going up. They already have, with it being an obstructive disease, they have trouble exhaling and getting the air out. So they already have trouble getting, expelling the CO2. And when they have that mask and that covering over their face, I think that's increasing their CO2 levels. And that's why they're short of breath and having trouble. Because I checked their oxygen, the oxygen is okay. I really believe that it's the CO2 levels. And I've seen so many different tests because we just had a doctor who, and he tested himself. So he's wearing the mask and he's even drew an ABG check to make sure and see and say, oh, no, that's not true because I'm fine. Well, you've got normal, healthy lungs. We're talking about patients who have compromised lungs. These are the ones that are going to have issues. And not all COPD patients are CO2 retainers either. So it's just a large majority of them. So
that's fascinating because when we hear about people who are medically unable to wear a mask and we think, okay, well, we'll not worry about them wearing a mask. What you're actually pointing out, it sounds like, is that the people who might truly be in a risk category and have a medical reason that they couldn't wear a mask are in fact the people who probably the most of anybody need one because their CO2 levels and their lung function. That's a fascinating twist that I hadn't heard anyone express before.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's really important for them to have friends and family that can help them and go do their grocery shopping. And these are the people that really need to be isolated. But their friends and family too need to make sure they're staying protected. Before the masks were required, I was wearing them when I go to the stores and stuff because I'm around patients that have COPD. So I want to keep not only myself safe, but keep them safe as well. So there are some Karens in the world that just say, I don't want to wear a mask. Nobody thinks it's comfortable to wear a mask. I'm a respiratory therapist. It's not comfortable wearing a mask. Nobody enjoys wearing a mask. It's something you have to suck up to do to keep not just yourself safe, but everybody you're around safe, and the people that they're around. So it's just, you suck it up and you do it. But there are some people, like I said, the COPDers and stuff that really can't wear the mask. So
yeah, I find that fascinating because that's in fact some of the people who have the worst risk category. So they're both unable to wear protection and they're at the highest risk. That's right. A fascinating one. Well, let's go back to normal life for just a second. When you are treating somebody, what kinds of tools do you have at your disposal when you run into somebody with COPD or other things? You mentioned sleep studies and things like that, and then beyond that, treatments. What kinds of tools does a respiratory therapist have at their disposal?
One of the main things we do is, of course, we make sure they're medicated appropriately. We try to get them into pulmonologists and stuff too, to have pulmonary function testing done to kind of get a baseline and keep an eye on them. One of the biggest things that I've noticed, and a lot of patients even do, even at home sometimes, is pulse oximetry. It's monitoring the SpO2, which is basically how much blood is in your oxygen. It's bound to the hemoglobin in there. So, but it's a nice non-invasive way to tell that. I love that they're doing this and taking the initiative to monitor at home, but you do need to be careful because quality is an issue. So if you get some of these cheap pulse oximeters, you're not going to get adequate results. So, and you could get yourself worked up over looking at these numbers when they're not true. So you got to go by your body too, and how you feel as well. But there's a lot of value into, you know, monitoring pulse oximetry, and that's one of the things that we do at AIRS is we, you know, really try to make sure we've designed devices like our action and flow monitor that monitor the action flow the patient's receiving, but also monitor the SpO2. We thought that was really crucial to do both because you're really ensuring that they're receiving the correct amount of oxygen. So
I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about AIRS. Obviously, AIRS is the way that that you and I met into being done work for AIRS, and great company, great product. Tell us a little bit about what your goal is there, because in your respiratory therapy, you saw a hole in the market of treatment and treatment delivery.
exactly. I've been a respiratory therapist for about 20 years now, a little over 20 years. I don't want to date myself too much, but I see the same issues time and time again with my oxygen users, and there were no good solutions out there. So I looked for the solutions. When I couldn't find any, I decided to go ahead and start creating some. So and now I'm working with Into Being, which is a big help because I am not an electrical engineer. So my first prototypes were very basic, and now look at these beauties.
This was not supposed to be a product plug, or a company plug, but
well, this is thanks to Into Being. This is thanks to you guys getting us,
no, you don't.
especially my project manager, Adrienne, yes, and the people behind the scenes like Shepard and Aaron, and we appreciate you all. I'm sorry if I forgot somebody, but yes.
We try to keep our business out of this, but thank you. Okay.
No, but you guys do a great job out there, and we really appreciate your support and getting, because you guys are a key part, because we're working hard over here so we can get these devices out, and you know, we need all the help we can get. It's, you know, we're trying to change the standard of care. So we're not taking on, you know, some small task or anything like that. We're trying to make a real difference. And with the things that are going on with COVID, our devices are needed now more than ever. This is really important because these COPD patients are our most vulnerable. They're least able to protect themselves. And you know, we're going to see some struggles, and I really hate to see, I mean, like I said, 175 million people around the world have this illness, you know, and we need to do something. That's why we're working hard and trying to get these projects out. And if they want more information, our website is oxygenalarms.com. You can come visit us, and we'll tell you all about what we're working on and our other products as well. So
that's great. And and from the community standpoint, what are you guys looking for at Oxygen Alarms at AIRS?
Lots of things. Connections, a lot of connections. It's all about having the right network of people. We're looking to tie into some oxygen distributors. So some of those DMEs that service some of the current oxygen users. We've actually are able to bill with this insurance code for our device. So this is a new revenue stream for them. So we're trying to make some great connections there. So if anybody knows people at CareLink and Lincare and Apria, those type of places, even Philips and Medline would be other potential partners for us. So we're trying to make connections. We need some help with marketing as well. We have our first product, our moisture exchange tubing, that's available for sale. We need a little help promoting that. Funding, of course, everybody does right now. It's been hard with what's been going on with COVID. So a lot of the businesses are feeling the hit. So, but we'd like to make connections and introduce people as well. So we'd love to talk.
Well, this is just fascinating, Valerie, because, you know, not only are you a practitioner who saw a need and tried to fill that need, but now what you do is so much more front and center because of COVID. And that's why I thought it'd be really fun to have you on here and tell us about this. I'm going to go away from this with a much greater appreciation for that link between the people who have things like COPD and the fact that they're the ones of all the people in the entire space who probably can't wear a mask because they actually have elevated CO2 levels that are going to be constrained, and yet they're at the most risk, as we would all agree, for COVID. That's a really important point that I don't think I've ever heard come out in anything. Let me go to our audience and see if anyone has a question for Valerie. We don't get a chance to talk to a respiratory therapist every day, so I want to see if anyone has a question for Valerie. Tony, you are live with us. If you unmute your mic.
Hey, Gene. Hey, Valerie. I really enjoyed that presentation. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're just fine.
Yeah, I was just wondering. So she threw out the number 175 million people that are suffering. And I was just Googling with the US number. It was like 37 million in the US that have respiratory problems. It sounds like because a lot of those kind of treatments, aren't they usually suggested and recommended through the pulmonologist? And I do remember from my hospital days, that's a small specialty. There's probably not 10,000 pulmonologists in the US. Seems like that would be the people that would be the best target. And I was wondering, therefore, whether or not, Valerie, you started networking with pulmonologists to see if you can pilot your product that way. That would be my question.
We do have yeah, great question, Tony. We do have a couple pulmonologists, and those would be great connections for us as well. So if you know a pulmonologist, send them our way, because we do love getting feedback from them and, you know, talking to them about our devices. Currently, you'd be surprised at how many people still have their COPD managed by their primary care doctor. It's quite often, and they don't go in there for their pulmonary function testing. We recommend at least once a year to have that test redone, because it helps us kind of track your status and notify us if we need to make changes to your medication as well. So we encourage people to go to a pulmonologist when you have a respiratory illness like COPD. Those are the best people, because those are the experts in there. But a lot of them are still seeing their primary care doctor. They get like albuterol and, you know, maybe some oxygen and sometimes a maintenance drug as well. Well, a lot of times a maintenance drug as well. And that's how they deal with it at home. So.
Gotcha. I can think of one. I'll type in the name of the one top pulmonologist I remember in Oakland County.
Thank you, Tony.
That is great. We love making those connections. That's wonderful. Any other questions for Valerie? Thanks for that one, Tony. Okay, looks like no other questions today, but Valerie Obenchain, respiratory therapist, founder of Advanced Interactive Response Systems, and just a wealth of information. We are very excited to have had you on today, Valerie, and as things progress, I don't know if you'd be open to coming back on at some point and talking about longer term findings, but we certainly enjoyed this today.
Yes, thank you. Me too. And I'm always willing to come back again. So thanks for having me, and have a wonderful weekend.
Just a pleasure. Thanks again. I love it. So great talking to practitioners. That's one of the things we've benefited from all the way through the COVID era. And of course, something we want to continue both with respect to COVID and also just in general, medical device development. People understand increasingly that you have to identify what the user is actually going through. And Valerie's an example of a user who's trying to create a better tool. And of course, here at Interbeing, we do a lot of creating devices for users. And next up, I want to welcome Adrienne Harris and Kehrer from our team, both startup veterans in their own right, to the show. And there's Aaron, there's Adrienne. Welcome, guys.
Hi.
Hello.
And we decided we were going to do a little discussion here today, because one of the things that teams often run into is the you can't get there from here problem. We sort of titled it the A to C fallacy, or the A to C pitfall. And in a startup environment especially, it's so motivating to jump over things, to say, I just got to get there fast. I just got to get to some next milestone, and to take those skipping steps and all three of us have each spent, I don't know, roughly 8-10 years in a scrappy startup, and we all had great experiences in those. And we just wanted to talk a little bit today about, first of all, that skipping process happens, right? People jump places, and we see the temptation for every startup to skip steps. But of course, no startup is perfectly funded. Nobody has all the money in the world or all the time in the world. So this really is a balancing act. And I thought we could start today with, as we think about, maybe let's call A I've got to show somebody something. I've got to have a proof of concept, or I've got to have a sketch, or I've got to have something. Let's call that A. And then we get on, and maybe down the road, B is the design process. And then we get a little further down the road, and maybe C is the manufacturing process. We could call it a number of things, and I'm sure during this conversation we'll break it up differently. Maybe D is the regulatory clearance. What have you guys seen that have been examples of things that get skipped along the way, that people are motivated to skip over?
Who do you want to talk first?
Yeah.
Let's go to Aaron first.
I think there's been, I know Gene, you and I have experienced a couple of cases where the documentation has been one of those big things of you're rushing so fast to get a design that's working that you can show to people, show investors or customers or whatever, that you really don't do the documentation, and you get to a point where, oh, now we need clearance, but we don't have any documentation. So now we're backfilling a bunch of design history work that we kind of should have been doing in maybe a lightweight level all along, but it's sort of, your engineers are now pulled in multiple directions with both solving problems from a product standpoint and trying to bring the documentation up to snuff where you can feel confident that you can submit it for some type of clearance. So that's one.
Yeah, documentation is a great example. Let's go to Adrienne. What's another example of places we're tempted to skip?
Aaron took my first one. I have this visceral memory of sitting on a manufacturing line trying to get it up and running with my laptop, and while helping everybody try and build a product, also trying to dig through 3 to 5 years of rough history to put together a documentation package to support what we're trying to do right then. And I mean, once you suffer through that, you get way more, we're going to document this from the beginning, and we're going to have that traceability. You know, I think another one is rushing to testing. You know, you've got these tests you need to do, whether they're third party or whether they're in-house, and maybe the device isn't quite ready. Maybe you don't have all the materials figured out. But you know that's going to be a long-term test. It's going to be a long test, it's going to be an expensive test, and the sooner we start it, the sooner we get the results. But if you do that test and you don't know all the things that need to go into it to begin with, you get it done, you get the results, but if something changes in another 3 months, 6 months, you might have to just redo that whole thing. And so that $50,000, that 8 to 12 weeks, all of that is lost, quite possibly. So, you know, making sure that the phase that your development is at meets the phase of the testing and what you need to get out of it is correct. That's another one that I've definitely experienced in life.
Dependencies is the word that just sort of is going to keep coming up and up and up again in this conversation, is what is this relying on to be worth having moved forward? What will you not regret moving forward? Yeah, when you mentioned the testing, I often think the number of times that we've been approached by somebody saying, I have my clinical trial all planned, and I'm ready to do my clinical trial so that I can submit to FDA. And number one, they're often surprised to find out that most 510K cleared devices don't need a clinical trial. And number two, the question becomes, well, what is the data that if you did need a trial, you would want in that trial? And that's going to fall out of something like the design control process, planning the verification and validation. And if that hasn't happened, we may successfully complete a trial. We may even get some good results out of the trial, but will those results be reportable? That's a completely different thing. You got to C and you got to D, but you missed B, and now E is inaccessible. As you guys were talking, I was thinking, Oh, I'm sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
I was gonna say Adrienne kind of touched on another one. This is whereas even for non-cleared devices where you're not, you don't have these big testing you have to do, you don't have to go through the regulatory agency. It's really easy to get in a situation where you have the design engineers on the manufacturing floor, either producing devices themselves or overseeing the device production and doing all the troubleshooting and quality control and things like that, where you hadn't done some of the work to either design into the device some ease of assembly or design out some complexity or put together coherent processes so that somebody who's not an engineer can sit there and build usable devices. And I think that's a kind of across the board thing that a lot of startups get themselves into.
This is something that you sort of maybe, I don't know, you or Adrienne earlier when we were chatting about this referred to as I can build one or I can build 5 of them, but going to 100 of them and then suddenly thinking that the cost of goods is going to have evaporated from it there's a lot of stuff in between there that has to happen many times.
Yeah, I mean, you get to a point where your cost of good estimates up front are based on hiring a labor at $12 to $20 an hour, but you rush things, or you got to get to the point where you're producing 100 devices a month or something like that, and now you've got engineers on the floor and you're paying them $50, $75 an hour, and they're not doing the other work, the development, design improvement work that you really hired them for, and so now your cogs and your margins are kind of all messed up.
I think Adrienne had some other manufacturing experiences. You want to ride forward on those?
Ramp up.
Mm-hmm.
We built 5. Sales projection says we need 5,000 in 6 months per day, or 500 per day, or we need 100,000 in this year. And it's, then you start, okay, well, let's just double our machinery. Let's double the people. Let's throw more people at it. Well, if your process hasn't been optimized at that point, you're going to spend so much more money troubleshooting. You're going to spend so much more money in scrap. Yeah, maybe you can actually get out those numbers you need, but putting the time up front to really optimize each process at each stage is going to save time and money in the long run. And so when somebody says, well, the sales projection says we need 100,000 per year in 6 months, starting in 6 months, and our line can only produce 500 a month. Okay, well, it's either we got to double stuff, we have to add shifts. Well, really, if you start looking at each process, you might have ways to increase the efficiency of each process prior to just throwing resources at it. But it's that balance of resources or the optimization takes time. So now you're saying, hey, don't purchase multi-cavity tooling yet. Let's try and take what we have and know what we need to do. But that how do we make as many as we think we're going to need versus how many we need now versus how many we can make now. And it's a really tough balance to make.
That optimization is often invisible while you're doing the optimization. Only the people that are kind of down in the minutia of working through all of those little details can really understand if the optimization is moving, if you're actually making progress or not. And so you can look at a team doing optimization and not see anything come out of them for 6 months and wonder kind of what's going on and whether, you're getting value out of this. And the value is not, you're not seeing that value in an immediate point, but it's when you get 3 months down the road after that, where you're smoothly ramping up to going from 100 devices a day to 500 devices a day, that is where that optimization really pays off.
That's a really important point, and it's something that as you get into the late stage, you think to yourself, I've got a design, I'm ready to ramp, and there's sort of even if A is your design and C is your ramp, there's this B in between of readiness for that. It reminds me too of some of examples that we've seen where at a very, very early stage, somebody tries to go from a very, very early prototype, not just to production, but to ramped production. So we're sort of missing B and C maybe even D on our way to E. One example that we did encounter one time was someone who had built 4-cavity steel tooling off of a design that hadn't yet shown actual functionality. And of course, sometimes people have a hard time wrapping their heads around design versus production process, right? The design can be established, but then the next question is, can we build a lot of them? And those being two separate domains that need their own independent thought is a really important point for the development process.
You know, I think it's important to look at where the outside pressure for that sort of thing comes from. You know, when you're raising funds, when you're talking to people that are interested in your product, they always want to know what the cost of goods is. And if you show them just an idea, I have an idea on paper, it's a really good idea, people want it. They go, well, how much does it cost to make? Well, at this point in the idea, you can't know how much it costs to make. One of the things I like to do is leverage what's very similar on the market. If you know that you can buy a Fitbit, I'm using an example of a pedometer for $30, you know they can make it for less than $30. Your first 500, your first 2,000 might cost you $20 to make, but you know that you can get it down there because other people have. And so when people start and they go, okay, well, I need to get the cost of goods down because I've told people that I can make it for $5. How do I do that? Well, let's go to multi-cavity tooling. Well, no, it's like, you know, that first 20, that first 500, that first 5,000 coming out at $20 instead of $5 is going to teach you enough that when you finally ramp up, you're going to know enough how to get that cost down. And so that balance of managing the outside pressures of where you need to be with where you really are and how to manage that is very difficult for a startup.
Yeah, that's a great point, Adrienne. Actually, what it reminds me too is when we say you can't get there from here, there are sometimes what we're saying is you missed a step and it's going to really hurt to go back and do that step, but it is possible. In other situations, and the analogy that you gave is an interesting one because, of course, Fitbit or iPhone or Android or anything, they've got so many units in the field. They can afford to spend the money to get the cost of goods down to that level, and that then enables that market that has a huge reach. And of course, in the med space, sometimes we don't have quite as big a market. We've got something that's maybe it's going to see 100,000 of these things instead of 100 million of them. And then the question becomes, is it worth spending that optimization in, we'll call it step B, to get to that cost of goods, or is there something fundamentally disjoint about the model? This reminds me of the conversation we were having with Jim Metzger the other day. You know, he's coming in and saying, I'm a manufacturer, but I actually care what your business plan is, which is really important because are you going to be able to scale that is huge. Those are great points. We talked a little bit about the design, and you started us out, Adrienne, with the question of testing. And of course, a lot of the test comes out of the design control process. And that's something that I know in our own practice, we've sometimes we'll go full board design controls. Sometimes we'll do what we call lightweight design controls to start capturing stuff while we're still in the sandbox. The point is always never to be overbearing with what we're doing. Maybe you can both give us some examples of places where if you haven't captured a design input, and just for our audience, right, the FDA design control process specifies that you're going to have things like design inputs, which includes the needs of the user, certain risks, standards compliance, things like that, and then design outputs, which defines your product, and then verification and validation that shows that your product does what you said it would do. But can you guys give us some examples of places where missing design inputs, if you wait too long to find out what those are, they can get you into an A, then C, then back to B sort of a situation?
Yeah, I think one that we've seen is not taking into account the standards your system will have to meet, you know, when to get cleared for the market. And we've run into a couple of situations where some of the electrical safety testing standards weren't really taken into account prior to actually executing the design. And so they got to a point where they finally got to getting the standards testing done and quickly found deficiencies and failures because they didn't read the standard and take into those considerations and actually implement them in the design. that's one that we've seen a few times.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one. Yeah. Adrienne, any other thoughts there?
I think one of the fundamental principles of development that is difficult to understand if you haven't been through it is the iterative nature of development. You know, if you look at the FDA's waterfall approach, it's design inputs, outputs, verification, validation, design transfer, and it looks like a line. Nothing that you do in development is going to be a line. You are going to swirl and swirl and swirl, and once you get to verification, you really might end up back in design inputs here and there, and that's normal. One of the things I think is a challenge is before a company really invests in the true documentation package, whether it's lightweight or full on, you have to have an idea, and that idea has to be developed enough to make it worth jumping into design inputs and that you're going to take it this whole distance. Well, as you develop that idea, a lot of the stuff that comes out of that will likely eventually be design outputs. It's going to be specifications. It's going to be the parts that you need and what you need them to do. And so it's easy like to get into that. I've got the device, I'm making the device, I'm doing the device, and I'm in design outputs. But I've found that when I truly dig in with a new project, especially a really complicated project, electromechanical or durable medical, when you sit down and do design inputs proper, so many things come out of that, like the risk analysis process. You can find the places where your device might fail, where it might lead to harm, where the probability of that happening is really high. And those things then what filter out of it, and that's the whole point of the process, are new inputs into your device development. And so if you make it too far down the road in the development from the concept of the design, you might lose some of that foundational work that you then have to go back and figure out. I liked Aaron's LED example, which I'm gonna toss back to you to explain.
Yeah, so I think there was one client at one point that they were using a blue indicator LED for, you know, just about anything on their device. And blue because it was cool, and I think it was part of their logo colors and stuff. And then once you start digging into some of the alarming standards, you realize that certain alarms require a red LED, certain alarms require a yellow LED, the blue LED actually means something when it comes to an alarming thing. But they'd gotten, you know, they had a design that, and they thought they were done and ready for production, and then they ran into this issue with the alarming standard and had to go back, you know, go backwards and figure out how they were going to accomplish meeting this alarm standard.
One blue LED is neither the same hardware nor the same logic nor any number of other things than the combination of colors and blink rates and everything else that are necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I mean from the risk analysis that Adrienne's touching on is that you know that is going to dictate what your alarming needs to be, and so there's all kinds of connections here where if you don't do the work up front and you just throw a flashing blue LED on your device and to warn users that, you know, something bad's happening, well, you haven't necessarily evaluated all of the bad things that could happen and then determine which ones were a high enough risk level that you had to do something important about it, and then that doing something important may have a definition that's already exists in a standard, and that standard will dictate what you have to do in the design to meet that alert or that alarm or that warning that you would want to give the user.
And of course, none of this is to say that one can't go out there and quick and dirty throw something together and show it to people and say, hey, this is where I am right now. This is a cool thing, and that's good. There's something though about understanding what those different stages are, what different levels of prototype you can go through, and what they mean to each group of people that you're going to need to show them to. Ultimately, culminating in your manufacturer who's going to build it for you, and the FDA who's going to clear it. Those are great thoughts. Adrienne, you alluded to some of the pressures that people feel, because I think it is important to recognize that these things don't happen in a vacuum. We feel that pressure to cut corners as startup founders and others to take that, I can get away with it, I can make that jump, and I gotta get there. But what are some of the reasons that these pressures are felt? Can we unpack that a little bit?
Time and money? I think that's unpacked. Startups have limited funds, and if you have funds, however you got them, there's probably some people and some interested parties behind them. And you've probably made promises to said people, and those promises were made in good faith. They were made in the best knowledge that you had at the time. And then things change. Development is iterative. It's iterative because you learn things. There's that you know what you know, you don't know things. And then there's a whole flock of stuff that you don't know, especially if it's your first time through the process. And so I think a lot of the pressure is if you said something was going to be done in 6 months, and then you find out you learned you have to change an LED color, and that's going to set you back a month, things like that. And so, really balancing what corners are acceptable to cut, where can you cut them without it leading to problems, more problems, unintended consequences are huge. I like to really balance the challenges when if management comes to me and says, we're behind schedule, what can we do? What can we go faster? How can we go faster? It's always like to balance between a patient risk and a business risk. You can say, hey, look, we could do this biocompatibility test tomorrow on the product we have, but the product we have might change. So we might have to do it again. But if it's a patient risk, if it's like, let's skip the biocompatibility test, now that one would get caught in on a lot of the clearances and stuff, but there's other tests that might not. That's where you really have to, as the people on the ground making the product, know where, no, we should not skip this. This is a safety thing. It's a harm thing. We could be killing patients if we do it versus, okay, if you want to dump an extra 50 grand to pull something in 6 months that we might have to do again, or we might not. Business versus patient risk. I think it's a huge process that weighs on a lot of startup founders.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. And of course that business risk, I guess if we go to the other level, because someone could hear all this and they could say, well, look, this is too much. I can't even hear this because, like you said, time and money, it's constrained. I've got to take risk. And okay, fine, I'm not going to take patient risk, but I want to take the business risk. I think that's a good thing, right? It's about being informed in that business risk and knowing what the consequence is of if I skip B or I don't do B to the level that I could do B to. Is it going to come back and is it going to make C impossible? Or is it going to make C a little less? Or am I going to have to circle back again? Or might I get away with it? And there's a probability I'll get away with it. And then it's a risk I'm really willing to take, and working through that and understanding what those consequences are for the business risk, again, not for the patient risk. Really important to the management of a startup's budget and timeline.
Sometimes it's a scope. Yeah. Sometimes it's a scope thing too, because you may have this grand design, at the very beginning, but there may be, an easier pathway or an easier system to make that would capture 80% of what you're expecting to do, and save you a lot of potential churn or time and money, save you a bunch of time and money to get to that point. One we see often with diagnostic devices is a lot of companies will go for as research devices first, and kind of work the bugs out from that standpoint, and then try to turn it into a clinical or a diagnostic. But there's other ones where you could look at the device, and based on all of the claims and things you're making about the device, you could trim some of those claims and convert what your idea is from, a class 2 510K pathway device to a class 1, register with the FDA and start selling device, and it's, you're looking at it from that standpoint, because the once you're adding more features and things like that, just tends to, it's not a linear, it's not a linear scalar when to the development.
Yeah, that's a good point. Understanding what those are. And I think also it is interesting because there are things you can look at, like the long lead items that are coming that really you might be in a position to take a shot. I think you had mentioned earlier, Aaron, about buying in quantity, right? There's certain points where you can say, well, we don't know 100% that what we're buying is going to be absolutely right because these other things have to happen first. But that's actually a dollar amount and a lead time that we can quantify, and we can decide what that risk trade-off is to be able to do it. It's all benefit risk analysis.
Yeah, that's Adrienne's pull ahead. We could buy 10,000 units now and be ready to start producing once we get the answer we're looking for, in a week. Or we could get the answer we're looking for in a week, realize those 10,000 units are no good. And now either we're trying to figure out how to rework them into the system, or we're just counting those as scrap, right? But we potentially could have bought ourselves 3 more months or something, you know.
And oftentimes that's worth it, because the burn rate in those 3 months can be very, very large. So those are important things to consider. That's very good. Any other thoughts on terms of the? I think we've sort of covered it here. You can't always get there from here, and sometimes getting there from here can be very painful. And realizing those skipped steps, or the steps when it is time to take a risk and jump ahead, because time and money are limited, and you have to make a decision and go forward. Talked a little bit today about some of the motivations why this happens, some of the pressures on folks, and some of the times that it's okay to take that risk on a business level, but certainly not on a patient level. Any closing thoughts from either?
Listen to your engineers.
Listen to your engineers. You know, I think one thing that we talked about in prep for this session is the types of prototypes, and I don't want to lose it. I think that was a really good conversation. We've all been through the startup land. We all know what it's like to have to try and convey the super cool idea that you have, and sometimes that means I like to call it a dog and pony prototype. You can take a box and you can put lights on it and you can make it go boop boop boop, and then you can show people, and it helps convey that idea of like, this is what it's going to do. But inside of that box might just be like a hamster wheel and you like some duct tape. You still got it to go boop boop boop, but then people go, well, you're done. Cool. So when are you in manufacturing? We're done. I got a box. It goes boop boop. Let's go. And it's like, no, inside we gotta swap out the hamster for like some actual components. And so kind of really mitigating and managing the expectations of where you're really at with where it might look like you're at. Same thing with different levels of prototypes for testing. You can have representative parts. If you just need to know the force it break between 2 components, you don't need the whole device to do that. You can get component 1, component 2, put it together, test it. Well, it doesn't mean your system is completely ready to go anymore. Similar with verification and validation prototypes. There's a lot of verification prototype testing you can do with things built off of a bench or out of the garage. And then there's testing like sterilization validation or biocompatibility, where you really need to be at the manufacturing site where you're going to be long-term. You need to be in a clean room, possibly. You need to know what your bioburden is. And so each of those prototypes are different. And when someone's holding something that looks like it's done, they can think you're more done. And you might still be years away from where you're going. And that's another big one that I think we run into a lot in this world.
Oh, that's great. The levels of prototyping, and I think a lot of established industries often have very defined levels of prototypes. Of course, in med device, it's hard because am I building a heart-lung machine or a tongue depressor? It's a very wide range. But I know in a lot they've come down to, here's this level of test bed, this level of mule in the auto industry or things, and then they move forward from there. But it's a very, very important concept. We've often talked, I guess, internally about, and I know a number of folks in the innovation space talked about NASA's technology readiness levels, and just the recognition that you have to take effort to push between those levels, and there's more nuance than you often realize up front. No, I'm glad you brought that up, Adrienne. Let's open it up for just a few questions and see if anyone has any questions or anything you're wrestling with that sort of rings true here in terms of the product development process and the, oh no, I'm at sea, but I think I forgot the kind of an issue and best ways to go out. If you have a question or a thought, please feel free to raise your hand on the Zoom meeting, and I'd love to have you come live with us for a couple of minutes. And we'll just wait here for a second on that. One of the ones that we didn't, we do have one here from our friend Olaf. Olaf, you're live.
Yeah, hi Gene. Good to be back with you guys again. And thank you to your to having those guests and knowledgeable folks there with helping with startups. Now I'm working with startups, but my question is more so about as a startup goes into a commercial phase in these times, COVID-19 times, the year 2020, and let's say a product gets an emergency use authorization, but the product was designed to deliver a very high performance, novel performance that can't be claimed because there is not enough data yet, and it hasn't gone through the fine review by the FDA to make those claims. But let's say you get an EUA, you can go into the market, you can start generating sales as a new company, a startup, commercializing, and then how soon would it then be when you can provide evidence and get another FDA review so that you can actually start making that claim? Any thoughts about that process or examples?
Yeah, so actually it's really interesting. It's what a lot of companies have to wrestle with if they've gone for an emergency use authorization, because number one, they know that emergency use authorization is going to go away at some point. We don't know when. I will say the one thing, maybe just to tweak the understanding a little bit, is that the EUA is tended to be very conservative. In other words, if you were trying to claim anything particularly novel, you pretty much weren't eligible for an EUA. So there were things like, for example, like face masks with antibacterial properties. Those weren't eligible for EUA, even though there is a product code for that under normal development. But there really is a wrestling there, which is, if I'm on the market with an emergency use authorization, the minute that goes away, at some level or another, my market's going to go away. And so being ready to do a 510K or whatever else is required to get the normal product ready for sale so that you can continue on that market, it's really only bought you some time is really the upshot.
Yeah, so from data too, right?
Yeah.
Or say that the EUA, it buys you some data too, because you have devices in the field that you can collect. You can collect kind of real world information off of. But I think my understanding with the EUA is that the FDA is looking at it as an expectation that the device that they're allowing under the EUA will eventually get cleared and turn into a cleared product through FDA. So they're expecting ongoing communication as you go forward.
Yeah. So if you get a EUA for a product which in itself is novel, and maybe you're even getting a patent granted, or hopefully, then what I understand you're saying is you could sell the product even with this benefit already. If you get an EUA, let's say it's an antimicrobial on it, but you just can't make that claim. You can just say like, well, it's a face mask. It helps to filter air or protect you from spit or something like that.
Yes, it was very much, especially with things like face masks, they were very specific. You're not going to call this antimicrobial. You're not going to make a number of claims about it. And you may be working on a product that has some cool claims, but that would have to go in the normal application.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was going to start selling a face mask that includes already hydroxychloroquine. What do you guys think about that? I'm just kidding. So.
That would be a combination product. We'll at least go with that. That would be a combination product. We know that much. Yeah, that's great. No, Olaf, I appreciate that. And it's actually a really good point you bring up, because it's very germane to the I'm at A, I'm at C. I skipped over B, because the EUAs are a really novel example of that, where, oh, look, suddenly I got accelerated. Well, was it really an acceleration? So I think it's very perceptive that you brought that up.
Yeah, because I think there are some level where you can get an EUA by just showing that your device is made with biocompatible materials, like the base materials are biocompatible. But that doesn't mean that when you finally get around to doing biocompatibility testing that you're going to pass.
Right.
Right. So.
Okay. Super. Thank you.
Thank you, Olaf. Appreciate it. Good to hear from you. Let's see, Ken Spencer. Question on the subject of you can't get there from here.
Yeah, so Gene, I think we asked this before, but if I missed the answer, I apologize. But so we have an EUA, we're in parallel. As soon as we get the EUA, we're starting the 510K stuff. But, my question specifically is that if the EUA is granted and we start selling product and the hospitals order several thousand units, okay, and then the FDA says the pandemic is over, if you will, and the EUA is no longer authorized, can the hospitals use the products that they've already purchased? I realize we would have to stop selling.
It's a great question, Ken. And I don't think we actually have clarity, and it could be different depending on what the product is and what the conditions of the EUA were. What you just said, though, is absolutely true, right? It's a marketing authorization. It's a distribution and marketing authorization. So you can be certain that if it goes away, distribution and marketing and sales would be off the table. But I don't think we have clarity on that. It's very hard. This is just a gut check. There's no, don't take this one to the bank, but it's very hard to imagine that FDA would force companies to initiate a recall on, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of devices that they had said it was okay to distribute. I would hope they would take that into account when they were thinking about it. On the other hand, you could also imagine, and again, this is completely conjecture at this point, that something more complex like a ventilator that maybe hadn't gone through all the things that you would normally want it to. You could see a reason for them then to say, you know what, guys, you're gonna have to send that back and stop using it. So just some guesses there, but I think your gut is right that it's certainly not going to be marketable at that point. Will it be forced to be withdrawn and returned? Anybody's guess right now.
Good, thanks, Gene.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Great question. Okay, let's see. Any other questions on this topic? I also want to open it up to any general questions or check-ins, community check-ins. We always love those community check-ins. While we're waiting for that, I just want to thank Adrienne Kehrer, who's Intubeing's Director of Product Development, and Adrienne Harris, Product Development Manager, for your wisdom and insight into these things. It's always fun to talk with you guys about these kinds of things, and hopefully it helps somebody to. None of this is criticism for any startup that's, you know, really getting in there and trying to do cool stuff and going as fast as they can. It's just more a caution of keep asking yourself at every stage, what's downstream of me? What are the dependencies? It's basic project management, right? What are the dependencies? What are the things, like you said, Adrienne, the known knowns and the unknown unknowns that you're up against, and really press into that, because you can be sure that there are a lot hidden around the corners. So greatly appreciate you guys today. And not seeing any more questions, I think. Oh, actually, there was one here. We'll follow up with that outside, although the question that Robin Yerk asked, I'll follow up with you separately, Robin, but just to answer a basic level, the question was about apps or devices that have apps and hardware combined with them. Basically, if it's participating in the diagnosis or treatment of a disease state or condition, it's a medical device. Doesn't matter whether it's an app or whether it's a device or it's a combination of those two. And so for your particular application, which we can follow up with offline, it really just depends on what your app is doing and whether it's how it's treating or diagnosing disease. But that's the important point right here, is that if it's participating in the diagnosis or treatment of a disease state or condition, it's probably a medical device, whether it's hardware or whether it's software. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for being with us on MedTech Crossroads today. Pleasure to have Aaron and Adrienne on here today, and Valerie earlier. Follow up with any questions you may have. And otherwise, we're looking forward to seeing you next week, Friday at 2 p.m. Thanks everybody for being here. Bye-bye.